The text on the screen is 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, but we're going to be studying from 1 Samuel. So if you'd like to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 13, that's where we're going to begin our study tonight. But when David this morning was talking about mentoring, that ties in well with our discussion this evening. And Jared and the deacons and the elders have all been talking over the last 6 months or so about having a mentoring mentality in our congregation, where older, mature Christians are spending time helping to encourage and develop younger Christians to have a strong faith. If I were to mention Dolores Rogers or Kathy Rogers or Dama Cook to you, you don't have an idea who they are. But Anna does, Rachel does, and Jewel does. Those are women in the congregation down in Paris, Kentucky, when our daughters were at very formative years in their maturity. They were older women in the congregation who spent time with them, mentoring, encouraging, and helping them grow and mature in the faith. The fact that these two girls are strong, dedicated, faithful Christians is not just their mom and dad. It is members of the congregation who took time out of their schedule to spend time with them. And that's what David talked about this morning in his lesson. And as he was preaching, I was making some mental notes about some things about mentoring that I'll be presenting to the elders and eventually to the deacons. We've already been talking about it. We just need to put the plan into action. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, Paul encourages Timothy to stay strong in the faith and to not make shipwreck of the faith, as some have done, specifically Hymenaeus and Alexander. You don't have to watch the news or read the news very long to see that there are all kinds of wrecks. Maybe you don't ever want to go to Romania to visit our missionary because you're afraid of a plane wreck. It seems like every day there's some report of a car wreck or a plane wreck or a train wreck. We read about or personally see marriages that are wrecked, lives of individuals that are wrecked. It is a tragedy to see a home wrecked. Imagine feeling the pain of broken heart as children are left at the mercy of the world. They're crying out for help. Mental hospitals, jails are full of people whose lives are shipwrecked. Now, the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 14 and verse 7 that we don't live to ourselves and we don't die to ourselves. Every home, every person, every child whose proper place in life has been thrown into turmoil affects all of their surroundings and the people who are around them. All of our actions, and this was the sermon that I gave this morning at the 9 o'clock service, all of our actions have an influence specifically on our children. They see and they hear what kind of lives that we are living and where our heart belongs. But then there's the tragedy, and David talked about this morning, in a life that is even more heartbreaking, and that's a shipwrecked faith. Tonight's study was actually written by my dad. I've told you before, once a year I preach a sermon from my dad. And because the elders have asked me to do a separate series of sermons that I'll actually begin next Sunday morning, then I've had to rearrange my sermon schedule, and so the sermon I normally preach around Father's Day is tonight. And my dad kept a list. I don't. My dad keeps a list of the dates and places where he preached his sermons. And the first time he preached this particular sermon on a shipwrecked faith was a year before my older brother graduated from high school. My older brother's 5 years older than I am. And for a long period of time, as we were kids. We played together all the time. We played with matchbox cars. In one house where we lived, when I was in the 6th grade, there was a bank of dirt that went up behind our house. Lots of trees at the top, very high bank. But it was sloped enough where we could get up there on our hip and be able to play with our cars. And we would take one of Mom's spoons out of her kitchen. She complained every time we did it. She didn't stop us, so we kept doing it. But we'd take one of the spoons out of her kitchen and we'd use it to dig into the dirt in that hill so that we could make roads for our cars. And we would do that. We would play with army men. I spent a lot of time with we fought too. Probably the only person in the world I've ever hit with my fist. Not that it did him any harm. He was 5 years older than I was. But we spent a lot of time together. When I was in junior high school, I made a list of jobs I did not want to have, and being a preacher was one of them. But my brother left home and went to Lipscomb University to study Bible and business. When he came back home from that first semester, he preached, and he did a good job. And I thought maybe I could be a preacher because my brother's doing that same thing. The next year, he married somebody who was not dedicated. She was a Christian, but she wasn't dedicated. To make a long story short, my older brother made shipwreck of the faith. And that's heartbreaking. You've got children who have made shipwreck of the faith. And as David talked about this morning, that's painful. The most tragic, burdened person on earth is the one who has wrecked his faith and is left without God. We have a good example of one in the Bible who has wrecked his faith, and that's King Saul. And that's why we're starting our study tonight in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 2, the historian tells us that Saul started his life out as a choice young man. Kish had a son whose name was Saul, a choice and handsome man, and there was not a more handsome person than he among the sons of Israel. From his shoulders and up, he was taller than any of the people. And if you look at chapter 11 and verse 13, you see an example of the faith that Saul had in God early on. Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel." Notice the confidence that he had in God, the faith that he had in God, and that he was willing to give God the credit. But his first downward step was impatience with God. How often, turn over to chapter 13, how often do we sin against God because we become impatient with God? 1 Samuel chapter 13, beginning in verse 8, the Philistines are attacking Israel. Beginning in verse 8, Saul waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, the prophet. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering away from Saul. And so Saul said, "Bring to me the burnt offering, the peace offering." And he offered the burnt offering. Now, right there, we Bible students should know he's made a mistake. He doesn't have the authority from God to offer burnt offerings. He's not a priest. Verse 10, as soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. But Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked the favor of the Lord, so I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, you've acted foolishly. You've not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. And now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. King Saul got scared, and he decided to bend the will of God. Actually, he broke it. But in his mind, he's just bending it. And he offers these sacrifices that he was not authorized to make. He was careful to preserve the outward rite, but his spiritual faith was lacking. Now, he didn't see any connection, apparently, between the command that was given and God who gave the command. He just thought it had to be done. But he wasn't thinking that God was the one on whom success was based. Not the burnt offering itself. It's the faith that obeys that Saul is lacking. The end justifying the means was what was motivating King Saul. It would have been far better to risk losing the battle and offending the holy nature of God. King Saul's second step downward, if you turn over to chapter 15, is that he eventually develops into a self-willed, power-mad individual. Chapter 17 is where God sends King Saul to kill the Amalekites. Okay? So in chapter 15, beginning in verse 17, we read where, let me back up a minute. You remember that King Saul chose not to kill the king, and he didn't kill all the animals the way God had told him to. Because as we do sometimes, King Saul thought he knew better than God. So verse 17, Samuel said, is it not true, though you were little in your own eyes, that you were made the head of the tribes of Israel? And the Lord anointed you king over Israel? So Samuel is saying, Saul, you were humble when you began. Little in your own eyes. That's what he's saying. You were humble when you began. The Lord made you king. The Lord sent you on a mission, and he said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are exterminated. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord? Saul said to Samuel, but I did obey the Lord. I did obey the voice of the Lord, and I went on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and I brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and I've utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people, notice how he tries to shift the responsibility. The people took some of the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the choices of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. The reason why we saved all these animals was to sacrifice them to God. But that's not what God told him to do with it. So Samuel said, verse 22, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, i.e. worship, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than worship, sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. Rebellion is as the sin of divination, witchcraft. Insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I have indeed transgressed the command of the Lord and your words because I feared the people and listened to their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Saul's sin was not one of ignorance. He failed to bring to mind, to remember that he was under the law of God. He was only partially obedient. But as we all know, in the eyes of God, partial obedience is not acceptable. Saul wanted the approval of man. That's why he wanted Samuel to go back with him. Saul was afraid that he a loose face in front of the people of Israel if Samuel the prophet wasn't with him. And so he wanted Samuel to go with him to help King Saul save face. And that's where his heart was. He wanted the approval of men. He tried to justify his disobedience by substituting worship for obedience, by putting the blame on someone else. And he was impenitent. He said, I have sinned, but he did not hate his sin. He hated the results of the sin. It's like a child with their hand in a cookie jar. They're not sorry they disobeyed mom. They're sorry they got caught by mom. Look at what Saul says in verse 30. Saul said, I have sinned. It's the second time he said it. But please honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel, and go back with me that I may worship the Lord your God. Saul was more interested in his honor, than he was the honor of Jehovah God. Who is king of my life? Who governs my will? Jesus or me? Saul's third step downward was a lack of appreciation for a good and loyal friend. He did not appreciate the value of Samuel as a friend. Saul was blessed by Samuel as a friend and as an advisor. And when Samuel heard of King Saul's failure, it broke his heart. Look back at verse 11. When God tells Samuel what happened, look at verse 11. God says to Samuel, I regret that I've made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me, and he's not carried out my commands. And Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. Do you have a friend like that? Do you have a friend who prays for you? Do you listen to that friend's advice? Do you follow that friend's advice? What a privilege. What an honor to have a friend like that. But Saul didn't appreciate it. Samuel not only talked to God about Saul's sin, but Samuel came to Saul. But when he found Saul, only Samuel's face was stained with tears. Saul's was not. Had it been David, David would have broken down. Sometimes contrast David's response with his sin, 2 Samuel chapter 12, and the response of Saul with his sin here. Saul's fourth step downward was when he allowed jealousy and envy and hateful passions to engulf him. Look over at 1 Samuel chapter 18. And here we fast forward in the life of Saul to the point where his envy is directed towards David. David has killed Goliath. David has joined the military. David is a commander over the military. David is faithful to God. And it's like everything David touches turns to gold. And rather than seeing that as a blessing to Saul and his kingdom, Saul becomes jealous and envious. And we read in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 7 and 8. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000. And then Saul became very angry for this saying, displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? At first, Saul was only jealous occasionally. But he let jealousy become an evil habit. Look at verse 9. Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. He should have been horrified at the thought of his heart's attitude towards David. But instead, he nourished that jealousy. He fueled that envy in his heart until it became a flame, and he let that jealousy lead him to being deceptive. Religion can be just a sham. It can allow us to become an imposter, where religion and life just don't have any connection to each other. Again, look at the difference in how Saul reacts and how David reacts. Saul was jealous. He was envious. David was loyal and useful. Chapter 18, verse 17. Saul said to David, here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles. Now, Saul thought, my hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. That was Saul being deceptive. Verses 21 and 22. Saul thought, I will give her, his other daughter, Michal, I will give her to David, that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. And therefore Saul said to David, for a second time you may be my son-in-law today. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David secretly, saying, behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. And you remember King Saul said, if you will kill 100 Philistines, you can have my daughter as your wife. And because of David's commitment to King Saul, David killed 200 Philistines. Such a sharp contrast between these two men. But now look at the end result of King Saul. What happens when a man wrecks his faith? He becomes desperate. Because if you don't have God in whom you can sink your trust, you panic. And you have to put your trust into somebody or something. 1 Samuel chapter 28. King Saul says very simply, God has departed from me. Those are some of the saddest words recorded in Scripture. King Saul saw a host of Philistines and his heart was afraid. His heart trembled. Battles had been won before when the odds were against him, and battles will be won anytime we're fighting on God's side. It doesn't matter what the odds are. Saul knew now, at this point in his life, that he had to go on without God. Saul calls on God, but he receives no answer. He fought some decisive battles, but there was only silence from God. What an awful spiritual situation for somebody to be in when God will not hear their prayers. We read of the silence of the desert, the silence of the night, the silence of the grave. We've seen people stand beside the dead and talk to them, but there's just dreadful silence in response. But this is more dreadful, to talk to God and God not respond. The appeal was made, and there was silence. It's not the silence of indifference. It's not the silence of an inability to hear. It's not the silence of weakness. It's the silence of rejection. It's the silence of refusal. In Proverbs chapter 1, verses 24 through 28, God, speaking through the wise man, said, I tried to help, but you listen. I offered my hand, but you turned away from me. You ignored my advice and you refused to be corrected. And so I will laugh at your troubles and I will make fun of you when what you fear happens. Disasters will strike you like a storm and problems will pound you like a strong wind. Trouble and misery will weigh you down. Fools will call for me and I will not answer. They will look for me and they won't find me. King Saul found himself in that same situation. The God that Saul needs and the only one who can help is now his enemy. Look at verse 16, chapter 28. Samuel speaking to Saul from the dead. This is the situation where King Saul has gone to talk to the witch. So Samuel speaks to Saul from the dead, and he says, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your adversary? It's a sobering thought to think that my older brother is an enemy of God at this hour. And so in desperation, King Saul has turned to the witch, seeking counsel from the very source that he had in fact tried to drive out of the land of Israel, knowing that that was a sin. So God allows the witch to call Samuel back from the dead, and Saul asked counsel of Samuel that he had consistently rejected while Samuel was alive. Why now has he thought that he would listen to Samuel from the dead? He seeks what once he could have had, but it was too late. The sentence of the death penalty had already been passed from the throne of heaven on the king. Look at verses 18 and 19. Samuel says to Saul, as you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Your sons are going to die in battle. Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Here's a wrecked man without God. And we see him at the end of the chapter lying on the ground, prostrate on the ground. His strength is gone, forsaken by his Creator. Look at verse 20. Saul immediately fell full length upon the ground and was very afraid because of the words of Samuel. Also, there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day and all night. Saul had willfully set aside the will of God. Back in chapter 13 and in chapter 15. Only now to find that God's law of retribution cannot be ignored. He had sown, and now he was reaping. That law can't be set aside or altered. Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8 is the New Testament wording of that law. It's not the first time God has told man about it. But God cannot be mocked. Whatever a man sows, he's going to reap. If you live and sow to the flesh, you're going to reap from the flesh. But if you live and sow to the Spirit, you're going to reap from the Spirit. Look at what might have been. Saul's role was self-chosen. Look at his life against the background of all of his associates. Think about all of those men who were leaders in the nation of Israel, who were military men. Saul had men serving in his military under him. David had men serving under him. There were other men who could have been military leaders. Look what Saul had and the opportunities that he had. He could have been a man of prayer like Samuel. There's no secret to being a person of prayer. Just do it. He could have been a man with a loving heart like his son Jonathan. There's no secret to being a loving person. Just do it. He could have been a man after God's own heart like David. There's no secret there. Just obey God. But he was not. Those other individuals nourished their faith. Saul destroyed his by nourishing his jealousy, his envy, and his pride. How is our life going to end up? The answer to that question depends on me. When my older brother left home, he was a strong Christian, faithful Christian. Maybe he would have been a full-time preacher. I think with his skills and his people skills, he would have been a good servant of the Word. I remember my dad made the comment after my brother left home. He said, if I don't have him where I want him to be now, there's nothing else I can do. My dad preached this sermon a year before my brother left home. There's time. I'm assuming he's still alive. He came to my dad's funeral. He did not come to my mom's funeral. How we live our lives is our choice. If we want to be able to say with the Apostle Paul at the end of our lives, I've fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. It's our choice. It's entirely in our hands what we do with our faith. If you need your faith strengthened, if you need sins forgiven, if you need encouragement, let us know. We want to help. Let's stand and sing together.